Mike, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I know you're a busy guy. You've got a big company to run, but I was privileged to get to hear some of your story, and I think you've got a fascinating story. So, can we start at the beginning?
Sure.
So, I understand you grew up in Alabama, but got here under some interesting circumstances as your family migrated from Cuba. Cuba, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I do have an interesting background. Born and raised in Jacksonville, Alabama, not too far from here. But my parents and my grandparents on both sides are actually originally from Cuba. They immigrated to the United States in 1962, shortly after the Communist Revolution took over the country in 1959. And so, growing up in Jacksonville, Alabama, great, wonderful small town in the South, speaking Spanish, eating Cuban food, and as soon as I walked through the door from school, it went from good Southern English to Cuban Spanish. It was wonderful. It was really just a wonderful. I didn't know any different.
Yeah.
All my friends were pretty shocked when they would come over to the house, but it was a really interesting way to grow up. And my family really came to the country. They were not supportive of the Castro regime when Castro took over. My grandfather, my father, my uncle were all thrown in jail because they spoke out against the government. So the rule there, the most important right we have is the right of free speech. And when you cannot speak out and you become persecuted for speaking what you believe, probably time to fight back or get out, and you gotta move. And so they unfortunately had to leave their country. They came to the United States with really nothing. Each of them were allowed to bring one bag out.
Wow.
So my mother, dad, my grandfather, grandmother, and my oldest brother, who was 13 days old, left literally with that in hand. Landed in Miami, Florida, at the airport. Didn't speak English, had no possessions, had no money, and had to start their life over again. And so they spent about a year in Miami, and there weren't a lot of jobs. My mother was selling women's clothing literally on the streets in Miami, door to door. My dad picked tomatoes. He did whatever he had to do to take care of the family. And, the good news is, like many communities, everyone helped everybody, right? So the Cuban community, the American government, as well as the American families that were in Miami, were very, very receptive and did a lot to help. But at the end of the day, you have to find work and you have to provide for the family. So after about a year, my grandfather had a friend who had come to Birmingham, Alabama, and was teaching at a wonderful school called Miles College.
Wow, that's great.
And had said, look, they're hiring an accounting professor. My grandparents both were educators in Cuba. My grandfather was an accounting professor. And he said, you got to come to Birmingham. So they came to Birmingham. He fell in love with Birmingham. Miles College gave him a wonderful opportunity, and he eventually taught there for, I think, roughly about 15 years. So that's how my parents also came here shortly thereafter.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing story.
Yeah.
And I know that sometimes we're not always the best at history, but 62 was also the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It was.
And neither of us were alive yet, but we've seen newsreels
Yeah.
certainly. But your family obviously had an up close personal experience with that, having recently migrated at that really pivotal time in 20th century history.
Yeah.
What was it like growing up really in the wake of that for your family?
Well, my mother actually, so in 1961, you had the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Right.
And my parents were still there. My mother was actually on a bus. They were basically forced working, taking young people out to go do work, forcing them to work in fields or do something for the government as the invasion started. And so she remembers it very clearly, believing the United States was going to be coming in and being able to liberate Cuba.
Wow.
Unfortunately, through a series of events, that didn't happen, and several thousand soldiers were killed or captured in that invasion. A year later, my parents come to the United States. And so I think, what I've learned from listening to my parents, as I try to remind people of this, Cuba is closer to the United States than Birmingham is to Atlanta. Okay? And when that revolution happened, that wasn't some opposing force who came into Cuba and took over from another country.
Yeah.
It was Cuban versus Cuban. And that is very, very concerning and very scary, that when someone, the communist leader Castro, was able to convince part of the population to turn on the other part of the population. We should just be very careful of that. And then also to really greatly appreciate the country we have here in the United States, albeit we're not perfect. We're the best country in the world.
Yeah.
That anybody can come here from anywhere in the world and build a successful life,
Yeah.
as my parents have done and many others.
Wow, fascinating perspective. And when you think about that, I think we can get complacent in thinking that somehow what we have and our experience will never change. And your family's experience about, and I love that, Cuban against Cuban.
Cuban against Cuban.
And that's probably not something that would have been contemplated 2-3 years before it actually happened.
No, and it's very unfortunate, but I remind people of that, just especially in the times we live in today, and how we have some challenges amongst ourselves here in the U.S. that we should just remind ourselves that we got to figure out ways to work through them and not turn on each other, because that would definitely not be very productive for us as a country.